Imagine it is the 14th of March, 2001. You are a 42-year-old civil engineer living in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Your apartment is on the 7th floor of a cream-colored building in the Palermo neighborhood, 2 blocks from the park where you take your morning coffee. You have worked for the same municipal firm for 19 years. Your savings account holds the equivalent of 38,000 US dollars, money you and your wife have spent 2 decades building, peso by peso, sacrifice by sacrifice. Your daughter starts university in September. You have already paid the first semester deposit. The economy has been bumpy, yes, but the government says everything is under control. The peso is pegged to the dollar, 1-to-1, guaranteed. The president said so on television. Your bank manager said so last Thursday. Everything, by all official accounts, is fine. If you have ever wondered why countries that seem stable can collapse almost overnight, or why ordinary people who do their everything right still end up losing everything, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It is played out in dozens of countries across more than a century of modern economic history. It always begins the same way. It always ends the same way. And the warning signs are always visible in hindsight, usually invisible in the moment. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and it keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Back to our engineer in Buenos Aires. 9 months after that ordinary March morning, the Argentine government froze every bank account in the country. The measure was called the corralito, which in Spanish means a small pen or enclosure, like where you trap animals, and that is precisely what it was. A pen around your money. Citizens were limited to withdrawing 250 pesos per week. For our engineer, $38,000 became 38,000 pesos, became a weekly allowance of 250 of them. His daughter did not start university that September. She started 3 years later, after the family had slowly rebuilt from wreckage. The peso devaluation that followed wiped out roughly 70% of the real purchasing value of any savings held in local currency. In a single legislative session, the savings of a generation evaporated. This video is about debt spirals, not debt in the abstract, theoretical sense that economists discuss in conference rooms, but the real, physical, life-altering kind. The kind that grinds up the savings of careful, hard-working, ordinary people who trusted the system and followed the rules. The kind that governments almost always deny is coming until the moment it arrives. The kind that has, without exception, eventually arrived in every country that walked far enough down a particular road. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. A debt spiral is not simply having a lot of debt. Many countries carry enormous debt loads and function normally for decades. A debt spiral is something specific. It is what happens when a country or institution reaches the point where it must borrow new money just to pay the interest on its old money. Think about that for a moment. Not borrowing to build roads, not borrowing to fund schools, borrowing specifically to pay the bill that came from the last time it borrowed. It is the financial equivalent of taking out a second credit card to make the minimum payment on your first credit card. It feels manageable for a while, then it does not feel manageable anymore. And then, with very little warning that most ordinary people receive, it stops entirely. The mechanism works like this. Governments spend more than they collect in taxes. The difference is called a fiscal deficit. To cover that gap, they issue bonds, which are essentially promises to pay money back later with interest. Foreign investors and domestic banks buy those bonds. The interest payments become a line item in the national budget. When the deficit continues and the debt grows, the interest payments grow with it. At some point, lenders start to worry that the country may not be able to repay. To compensate for that worry, they demand higher interest rates. Higher interest rates mean higher payments. Higher payments mean a bigger hole in the budget. A bigger hole means more borrowing. More borrowing at higher rates means even bigger payments. The spiral locks in. And at that point, there are only 3 exits. Default, which means simply stopping payment and triggering a crisis. Inflation, which means printing money until the currency loses value and the real weight of the debt shrinks. Or austerity, which means cutting government spending so severely that it causes economic pain deep enough to balance the books. None of these exits is painless. All of them have been used. And history shows that the people who bear the pain are almost never the people who created the problem. Debt is not like a fire that burns a building down. It is more like water finding cracks in a foundation. Slow, quiet, invisible from the surface, until the morning when the floor gives way and everyone acts surprised, even though the water had been seeping for years. This brings us directly to our first major historical case study, and it is one of the most dramatic and instructive in modern history. Weimar Germany. The year is 1921. Germany has just lost the First World War. Under the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, Germany was required to pay reparations totaling 132 billion gold marks. That figure was roughly equal to 32% of Germany's entire annual economic output. Germany did not have this money. Germany had been financially destroyed by 4 years of the most expensive war in history up to that point. So the German government did what governments in debt spirals always eventually do. It printed money. The government's central bank, the Reichsbank, began creating new currency to cover its obligations. In 1919, $1 bought approximately 48 German marks. By November 1923, $1 bought 4.2 trillion marks. Not billion, trillion. What did this look like for ordinary Germans? A loaf of bread that cost 160 marks in 1922 cost 200 billion marks by late 1923. Workers were paid twice a day and would sprint from their workplaces to buy food before their wages lost value. Wheelbarrows of cash were used to buy groceries. Children used bricks of currency as building blocks because the paper was worth less than toys. Savings accounts of German families, representing decades of labor and sacrifice, were wiped clean. Middle-class families who had been comfortable were reduced to poverty in months. A woman named Anna Eisenmenger, a Viennese middle-class widow, kept a detailed diary of this period. She described selling her late husband's gold watch just to buy potatoes and flour for a week. She wrote that she could not decide which was more painful, the hunger or the humiliation of watching everything built dissolve into worthless paper. The mechanism was straightforward. Germany had obligations it could not meet through taxation alone. It printed money to meet them. Printing money increases the supply of currency. More currency chasing the same amount of goods means each unit buys less. Prices rise. When prices rise fast, people expect them to rise faster tomorrow, so they spend money immediately. The technical term for this is hyperinflation, which destroys the practical function of money as a store of value. The damage to middle-class confidence created conditions for political instability through the 1920s and 1930s. Do you think you would recognize the early warning signs in real time, or only in hindsight? Drop your answer in the comments. Almost nobody recognizes these patterns in the moment. Now we travel to Japan in 1991. Japanese companies dominated global manufacturing. Tokyo's real estate market was valued higher than all real estate in the US combined. In 1991, asset prices began to fall. Land values collapsed and stock prices fell by more than 60%. Japanese banks hid the losses, a process called evergreening, keeping dying loans alive artificially on paper. This resulted in a balance sheet recession, where the private sector spent decades repairing debt rather than investing. Japan's lost decade stole growth and opportunity from an entire generation known as the Lost Generation. Argentina in the 1990s was praised for its convertibility plan, pegging the peso 1-to-1 with the dollar. But by 2001, interest payments consumed 22% of government revenues, leaving no margin for shocks. Foreign lenders stopped buying bonds, the government froze bank accounts, and the peso was devalued by 67% overnight. Any savings denominated in pesos lost 2/3 of their dollar value in weeks. More than 50% of Argentine citizens fell below the poverty line in the 12 months that followed. A middle-income country, by the standards of that era, one of the wealthier nations in Latin America, was reduced to soup kitchens and barter markets in the space of a single year. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting financial systems they do not understand, assuming that because things have been stable, they will remain stable. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe, because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks. Now observe what all of these cases have in common. Germany 1923, Japan 1991, Argentina 2001. 3 different countries, 3 different eras, 3 different political systems, 3 completely different surface-level responses. But underneath every single one of them, the same mechanism runs like a hidden current. Debt obligations that grew beyond the productive capacity of the economy to service them, followed by a reckoning that was delayed until delay was no longer possible. Followed by a transfer of pain from the institutions and decision-makers who created the conditions onto the ordinary people who had the least ability to understand what was happening and the least ability to protect themselves. In Germany, the pain was inflation. The savings of the middle class were destroyed. People on fixed incomes, pensioners, civil servants, anyone whose wealth was stored in paper currency were devastated. Meanwhile, those with real assets, those who owned factories, farmland, machinery, hard property, found that their assets repriced upward in nominal terms. Their debt, which they owed in marks, shrank in real terms as the currency collapsed. The pattern is precise and consistent. Debtors with hard assets benefited, savers with paper claims lost. In Japan, the pain was opportunity cost, which means the loss of what could have been. A generation that should have entered a dynamic labor market instead entered a stagnant one. Companies that should have invested and grown instead spent their energy quietly deleveraging, which means paying down debt rather than building new capacity. The pain was not dramatic and visible. It was slow and invisible, spread across millions of individual decisions not made, careers not launched, companies not built. In Argentina, the pain was immediate and physical. Retirement savings wiped out overnight. Middle-class families suddenly unable to access their own money. Business owners who had priced contracts in pesos finding that the real value of those contracts had evaporated. And crucially, like Germany and Japan, the people who made the decisions that led to these outcomes largely did not experience the consequences personally. And here's the detail that history keeps returning to. Lebanon, 2019. A banking system had been attracting foreign deposits for decades by offering interest rates far above the global average, sometimes 10 to 15% annually on dollar accounts. This was not generosity, it was necessity. The Lebanese government and banking sector needed constant inflows of new money to pay the obligations from old money. When the inflows slowed, as they always eventually do, the structure collapsed. By 2020, Lebanese banks had imposed informal capital controls, meaning they simply refused to let depositors withdraw their own money. People who had worked abroad, sometimes for decades, sending home savings to Lebanese banks, found those savings locked away behind closed doors. The Lebanese pound lost more than 90% of its value against the dollar by 2021. In a country that imports the majority of its food and medicine, that collapse translated directly into hunger and medicine shortages. By 2022, estimates placed more than 80% of the Lebanese population below the poverty line. The fourth largest city country in the Arab world, historically one of the most cosmopolitan and educated societies in the Middle East, was reduced to rolling blackouts and food bank lines within 18 months of its financial system cracking. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, and this is where history gets uncomfortable. Because in every single one of these cases, people were told by official sources that things were manageable. Argentina's IMF loan agreements told the world that debt was serviceable. Japan's regulators told investors that bank balance sheets were sound. Lebanon's central bank governor gave television interviews insisting the peg would hold, weeks before it did not hold. The warnings, when they came from outside the official structure, from independent analysts, from smaller publications, from citizens watching the gap between what they were told and what they could see with their own eyes. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. Debt spirals have been part of the human economic record since at least the Roman Empire's currency debasements in the 3rd century AD. They are not aberrations. They are a predictable consequence of specific structural conditions that recur across different political systems in different eras. The only question is whether you will understand the mechanism clearly enough to recognize the conditions when they are forming around you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. The human cost of these events is something that does not survive well in economic summaries. Economic papers talk about output gaps and sovereign spreads and debt to GDP ratios. The gap between those bloodless abstractions and what they mean in physical human terms is enormous. Let us be specific. In Argentina, after 2001, a study published by the Argentine Catholic University estimated that the poverty rate surged from roughly 35% in late 2001 to 57% by the middle of 2002. That means in the space of 6 months, roughly 4 million additional people crossed the threshold into poverty. These were not people who had been poor before. Many were middle-class families who had savings, who owned small businesses, who had followed every official instruction. A retired schoolteacher in Cordoba who had saved her entire career found that her pension, denominated in pesos, purchased approximately 1/3 of what it had purchased 18 months earlier. A small business owner in Rosario who had kept his working capital in the bank found it frozen and then devalued. He closed his business, his employees lost their jobs, his landlord could not collect rent. The loss cascaded outward. In Weimar Germany, the groups hit hardest were precisely those who had been most responsible. German middle-class families had a cultural tradition, reinforced by the experience of the previous generation, of saving in government bonds and bank accounts denominated in marks. These were considered safe, conservative, responsible financial behaviors. They were catastrophic. Families who had saved in war bonds issued by the German government to finance the First World War found those bonds worth essentially nothing by 1923. The savings of a generation, built on the most conservative financial instincts available, were erased. The contrast with those who survived well is instructive, not comforting, instructive. In Germany, landowners and industrialists whose assets were physical saw their debt loads shrink in real terms, while their hard assets retained value. In Argentina, people who held dollar-denominated assets outside the domestic banking system, either in foreign accounts or in physical dollars kept at home, found that their purchasing power actually increased relative to their neighbors after the devaluation. In Japan, the companies and individuals who had avoided the debt-fueled asset bubble of the 1980s entered the 1990s with clean balance sheets and were able to acquire assets at distressed prices, while their indebted peers were paralyzed. In Lebanon, the pattern held exactly. those with foreign currency accounts in banks outside Lebanon, those with real estate and markets outside Lebanon, those with professional credentials that allowed them to work abroad fared incomparably better than those whose wealth was trapped inside the domestic system. The Lebanese diaspora, numbering in the millions across the world, found themselves in a position of relative strength, while those who had stayed and trusted the domestic financial system faced devastation. This is one of the most consistent patterns across all debt spiral events in modern history. Geographic and asset diversification, spreading your financial life across different systems and different types of assets, rather than concentrating everything in one place, was not just useful. In many of these events, it was the difference between survival and ruin. Now here is what the historical record actually shows about the people who came through these periods. This is not financial advice. Please read that clearly. This is a historical observation about documented behavioral patterns, nothing more. Every individual situation is different, and any financial decision should be made with qualified professional guidance. But the historical record is clear enough to describe. Those who navigated debt spiral events most successfully shared several documented patterns. First, they had early awareness of the structural problem, not necessarily months or years early, but early enough to act before the bank runs and freezes and devaluations made action impossible. In Argentina, people who moved savings out of peso-denominated accounts and into dollar-denominated holdings before December 2001 preserved far more value than those who acted after. In Lebanon, those who converted pound holdings to dollar holdings or moved assets offshore before the informal capital controls were imposed in late 2019 retained access to their money. The window between the warning signs becoming visible to an informed observer and the window closing entirely is often measured in months, not years. Second, those who survived held assets that existed outside the distressed system. In Germany, this meant physical property, foreign currency, or tangible goods. In Japan, it meant clean balance sheets without debt. In Argentina, it meant dollar accounts, foreign real estate, or business operations with revenue streams outside the peso system. The common thread is that their economic survival was not entirely dependent on the health of the single system that was failing. Third, and perhaps most importantly, those who came through had skills and productive capacity that were valuable in the new post-crisis environment. Knowledge and productive capability were the most portable form of value in each of these transitions. Let us return now to our engineer in Buenos Aires. His name for this story is Miguel. In December 2001, Miguel's bank account was frozen. His daughter's university enrollment was postponed. Over the following 2 years, his municipal employer delayed salary payments repeatedly as the government struggled to manage its obligations. His savings, when he was eventually able to access them, had lost approximately 60% of their real value. He was not destroyed. He adapted. He found contract work through an engineering firm that had clients in Uruguay and Chile, meaning his income arrived in currencies not subject to the Argentine peso's collapse. His wife, an accountant, began working with small businesses, navigating the new economic environment, businesses that needed help understanding a completely changed set of financial rules. By 2005, Miguel's family was stable again. His daughter eventually completed her degree in architecture. She moved to Spain in 2008 because the structural instability of Argentina's economy had made her quietly uncertain that her professional future was best built at home. That migration, multiplied millions of times across countries that have experienced debt spirals, is itself one of the most significant and least discussed human costs of these events, capital fleas. And so do the most educated and mobile people. The country is left managing its crisis with a reduced talent base. The spiral finds new depths. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. The case studies in this video reflect specific historical circumstances that may differ substantially from any current or future situation. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. The patterns described here are drawn from documented historical events and are intended to build understanding, not to prescribe action. This video is not for everyone. Most people will scroll past it. Most people will hear the word debt and assume it applies to someone else, some other country, some other time. But if one person in your life is watching the numbers in their own country and feeling a quiet unease they cannot fully explain, share this with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Understanding the mechanism is the first defense, not because it makes you immune, but because the people who saw these patterns clearly, even partially, even imperfectly, had time to make different decisions than those who did not see them at all. Subscribe for more historical analysis like this, and I will see you in the next one.